Die Glocke, December 1944. You're standing in a concrete chamber beneath a mine complex in the frozen mountains of Lower Silesia. The walls are 3 feet thick, the floor is torn apart, and in the center, where something massive once stood, there's nothing but empty mounting points still leaking a strange purple residue. Whatever was here is gone. So are the 60 scientists who built it. They were all executed, every single one. Soviet forces advancing on Lower Silesia in January 1945 found the Wenceslaus mine complex abandoned. Strange circular structures remained. At the Nuremberg trials, SS General Jakob Sporenberg testified about a top-secret project codenamed Die Glocke, the bell. He described a bell-shaped device, 9 feet wide, 12 to 15 feet high, filled with a metallic liquid the Germans called Serum 525. The device required more electricity than a small city. 5 of the first 7 scientists who tested it died from exposure. Then, in December 1944, SS General Hans Kammler, the man who built the V-2 rocket bases, personally oversaw the bell's removal. Both Kammler and the device vanished. Neither has ever been found. Jakob Sporenberg testified at his 1950 trial that 60-plus scientists and technicians working on Die Glocke were executed by the SS in late 1944 to preserve secrecy. The concrete structure called the henge remains near the Wenceslaus mine, 11 feet thick, designed to support massive weight and vibration. Polish journalist Igor Witkowski published testimony in 2000 claiming he'd seen classified Nazi documents describing the device in detail. The documents described 2 counter-rotating cylinders filled with a mercury-like substance, possibly a thorium-mercury compound, rotating at high speed. British scientist Nick Cook investigated for Jane's Defense Weekly in 2001 and confirmed the site showed evidence of high-energy experiments. Test logs allegedly described strong biological effects on test subjects. 5 of 7 researchers died within weeks of initial tests. SS General Hans Kammler, one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany, personally supervised the bell's evacuation in December 1944, then disappeared. U.S. Intelligence documents from Operation Paperclip show intensive searches for Kammler and non-conventional weapons in the same region in 1945 and 46. Historians argue Die Glocke never existed. They say it's Cold War mythology, a conspiracy theory based on misinterpreted testimony about conventional weapons research. Sporenberg was facing execution and may have fabricated exotic weapons claims, hoping for leniency or prisoner exchange value. The henge structure was simply a cooling tower for a standard industrial facility. But the structure itself makes no sense for a cooling tower. It's far too massive, too reinforced, built with materials and engineering that suggest something generating enormous vibrational stress. And Kammler's disappearance remains one of the great mysteries of World War II. He commanded V-2 production, jet aircraft development, and underground factories. He was more valuable than almost any other Nazi. Yet he vanished completely in April 1945, with no confirmed death, no capture, no body. Some researchers ask, what if Die Glocke was real, but not what we think? Not anti-gravity, but something else. An experimental reactor, a particle accelerator, a weapon producing radiation or electromagnetic pulses? What if the bell was evacuated not because it worked, but because its failure contaminated the entire facility with something the Nazis couldn't clean up? Or what if it did work, and Kammler used it as leverage, trading the device to Allied intelligence in exchange for his escape? Why did the U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps spend 18 months searching specifically for Kammler and special weapons in Lower Silesia? Why are Kammler's final days still classified in multiple national archives? If Die Glocke was mythology, why does the concrete structure suggest engineering for something that would generate catastrophic vibration and heat? From Nazi experiments buried in Polish mines, we crossed the Atlantic to a hotel room in Manhattan, where another kind of weapon disappeared the night its inventor died. Tesla's Teleforce. January 7, 1943. Nikola Tesla dies alone in his hotel room at age 86. Within hours, before the body is even removed, FBI agents and Office of Alien Property officials arrive. They seize his safe. They confiscate papers. Tesla had told reporters just 2 years earlier that he'd perfected a teleforce weapon, a particle beam that could destroy aircraft 250 miles away. Now those plans are gone, and the government says they never existed. Tesla publicly announced his peace beam or death ray in 1934 and 1937, claiming it could project concentrated beams of particles through the free air with tremendous energy, effective against aircraft and ground targets. He offered it to the U.S. government. They declined. He approached Britain, the Soviet Union, and Yugoslavia. In 1940, he received a $25,000 payment from the Soviet Union, though it's unclear if he delivered working plans. On January 5, 1943, Tesla was found dead. By January 9th, the FBI's technical laboratory had examined all his papers, concluding his thoughts and efforts during at least the past 15 years were primarily of a speculative, philosophical, and somewhat promotional character. But the actual contents of those papers remain largely classified. Tesla announced the weapon in a 1934 New York Times article, describing a beam of force that could bring down 10,000 aircraft at 250 miles. In 1937, at age 81, Tesla gave a technical lecture claiming the weapon was teleforce, not death ray, based on particle acceleration principles. He delivered a 16-page technical paper on the weapon to the U.S. War Department in 1935. It was reviewed and rejected as impractical. Yugoslav intelligence documents declassified in the 1990s show Tesla offered the weapon plans to Yugoslavia in 1939. Soviet archives confirm a $25,000 payment to Tesla in 1940 for technical consultation on directed energy weapons research. Within 10 hours of Tesla's death, the Office of Alien Property Custodian seized all his belongings, including 2 truckloads of papers, claiming authority because Tesla was technically a foreign citizen, never naturalized. Dr. John G. Trump from MIT, uncle of Donald Trump, examined the papers for the FBI and reported them mostly theoretical. But key documents were immediately classified and sent to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. FBI files released in 2016 under FOIA show the Bureau continued investigating Tesla's weapons research through the 1950s, with multiple sections still redacted. Tesla was a brilliant inventor in his youth, but became increasingly erratic and grandiose in old age. The death ray was theoretical fantasy, not practical engineering. No prototype was ever built. No one who examined his papers found anything workable. He was seeking funding by making wild claims about superweapons, a common pattern for aging inventors desperate for relevance and money. But 4 major governments took him seriously enough to offer money. The Soviet payment was substantial, equivalent to $500,000 today. And if the papers were truly worthless speculation, why did the U.S. government immediately classify them, store them at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, home of foreign technology analysis, and keep portions classified for 70-plus years? The FBI's own files show they considered Tesla's weapons research a counterintelligence concern well into the Cold War. What if Tesla had actually solved a piece of the particle beam puzzle? Not a complete weapon, but a breakthrough in particle acceleration or atmospheric transmission that was decades ahead of published physics. What if the death ray wasn't a ray at all, but a method of wireless power transmission at destructive intensities? Soviet and American-directed energy weapons programs in the 1950s through 80s explored remarkably similar concepts. Where did that research start? Why does the FBI's file on Tesla run to 250-plus pages if his later work was merely speculative? What is in the portions of his papers still classified today, 80-plus years after his death? Why did multiple intelligence services from rival nations all pursue his weapons concepts if they were obvious fantasy? While Tesla's weapon vanished into government vaults in New York, on the other side of the planet, the Japanese were building something equally impossible and then destroying every trace of it themselves. Japanese I-400 submarine aircraft carriers. July 1945. You're looking at the largest submarine the world has ever seen, 400 feet long, carrying 3 attack aircraft, capable of striking any target on Earth. The I-400 can circumnavigate the globe 1.5 times without refueling. It's invisible to radar, can dive 330 feet deep, and could launch a biological weapon attack on the Panama Canal or Los Angeles. The war ends before it can be used. Within months, the U.S. Navy deliberately sinks all three. The blueprints are burned, and for the next 15 years, America pretends they never existed. The Sentoku-class submarines I-400, I-401, I-402 were commissioned by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto in 1942, designed specifically to strike the U.S. mainland. When U.S. forces captured them at war's end, they were the largest submarines in the world, a record that stood until 1960. Rather than bring them home for study, the U.S. Navy took them to sea off Hawaii and scuttled them. In 2005, a deep-sea research team from the Hawaii Undersea Research Laboratory discovered I-401 at 2,300 feet depth, intact. Her location had never been officially recorded. The I-400 was 400 feet long with a displacement of 6,560 tons, larger than American fleet submarines by nearly double, and larger than any submarine until the USS Nautilus in 1960. Each submarine carried 3 Aichi M6A Seirin floatplanes in a 115-foot waterproof hangar, could launch them in 30 minutes, and recover them after the mission. Maximum range, 37,500 nautical miles, enough to go to any point on Earth and return to Japan without refueling. Original plans called for 18 submarines. Only 3 were completed before Japan surrendered. Captain Toshio Kusaka of I-401 testified post-war that their final mission, Operation Hikari, was to attack the Panama Canal locks with biological weapons, likely plague-infected fleas produced at Unit 731. The U.S. Navy captured I-400 and I-401 in August 1945, I-402 in September 1945, and sailed them to Pearl Harbor for examination. In 1946, as Soviet observers demanded access under Allied agreements, the U.S. Navy took all 3 submarines to sea and scuttled them off Oahu, officially to prevent Soviet acquisition of the technology. All design documents captured from Japanese naval archives were classified and stored separately from general war records. Declassification didn't begin until the 1990s. The I-400 submarines were impressive engineering, but strategically irrelevant. They came too late, carried too few aircraft to make a difference, and were far too expensive. Japan built them out of desperation. The U.S. scuttled them because they were obsolete curiosities not worth maintaining, and sharing them with the Soviets would have been a propaganda gift. The submarines represented the end of a technological dead end, not the beginning of anything useful. But the U.S. Navy didn't treat them like obsolete curiosities. They examined them intensively for months. Navy engineers measured every system, and then when the Soviets asked to see them as part of Allied cooperation agreements, the Americans rushed them out to sea and destroyed them overnight. If they were worthless, why the panic? Why not let Soviet engineers see this dead-end technology and waste their time? What if the I-400 design solved problems in submarine warfare that the U.S. didn't want anyone else to see? The hangar design, the catapult system, the watertight aircraft storage, all of it was decades ahead of American or German submarine technology. Some researchers note that U.S. submarine-launched missile systems developed in the 1950s bear striking similarities to the I-400's aircraft hangar and launch mechanisms. Did the Americans destroy the evidence while quietly copying the innovation? Why did the U.S. Navy scuttle the submarines so hastily instead of preserving at least one for permanent study? What happened to the Japanese engineers and designers who built them? Were they recruited into American programs? Why are the exact specifications and capabilities of the I-400 still partially classified 80 years later? From submarine carriers hidden in the deep Pacific, we turn to the skies, where Allied and Axis pilots both saw something that wasn't supposed to be there. Foo Fighters, November 1944 to May 1945. You're flying a night mission over Germany. Your squadron is approaching the Rhine Valley. Suddenly, glowing spheres appear off your wing, red, orange, sometimes silver. They pace your bomber at 300 miles per hour. They maneuver impossibly, making right-angle turns, matching your every evasive action. You radio in. Your squadron commander sees them too. So does every crew in the formation. Intelligence debriefs you and says they're Nazi secret weapons, but then your German counterparts start reporting the same things, and both sides realize nobody knows what they are. Starting in November 1944, Allied aircrew over Europe began reporting mysterious lights and objects that followed their aircraft. The sightings peaked between December 1944 and February 1945. American pilots nicknamed them Foo Fighters, after a Smokey Stover comic strip phrase. Reports came from B-17 and B-24 bomber crews, P-51 fighter pilots, and night fighters. Descriptions were consistent: glowing spheres or disks, 3 to 10 feet in diameter, maneuvering at impossible speeds, showing no hostile intent but demonstrating flight characteristics beyond any known aircraft. After the war ended, captured German pilots revealed they'd seen identical phenomena and assumed they were Allied secret weapons. The first major publicized report appeared in the New York Times on January 2, 1945. Floating mystery ball is new Nazi air weapon. But the article notes that pilots had been seeing them for weeks. The 415th Night Fighter Squadron, based in France, filed multiple reports November through December 1944, describing orange lights that flew in formation with their aircraft at 260 miles per hour. Captain Edward Schluter, flying a Bristol Beaufighter on November 23, 1944, reported 8 to 10 bright orange lights off the left wing, flying through the air at high speed. Reports came from multiple Allied air forces, USAAF, RAF, and Luftwaffe pilots independently described nearly identical phenomena. Objects demonstrated flight characteristics impossible for 1940s technology: instant acceleration, right-angle turns at high speed, apparent immunity to anti-aircraft fire, ability to pace aircraft at any speed from 200 to 400 plus miles per hour. Official investigation by U.S. 8th Air Force Intelligence concluded pilots are seeing something, but no explanation was provided. Post-war interrogation of German scientists and pilots revealed they had seen the same objects and assumed they were Allied weapons. Reports abruptly ceased in May 1945. Sightings dropped to nearly zero after VE Day. Foo Fighters were misidentifications of mundane phenomena under stressful combat conditions. Possible explanations include ball lightning, Saint, Elmo's fire, electrical atmospheric phenomenon, reflections from ice crystals, optical illusions from exhaustion, flares, German V-1 or V-2 rockets seen at odd angles, or anti-aircraft tracer fire. The consistency of reports simply shows that pilots shared stories and influenced each other's perceptions. The phenomenon stopped because the war ended, and pilots stopped flying combat missions in those specific conditions. But ball lightning and St. Elmo's fire don't pace aircraft for 20 minutes at a time. They don't follow evasive maneuvers. They don't appear simultaneously to multiple aircraft spread across a combat box formation. And the most experienced pilots, men who'd flown hundreds of combat hours and knew every type of flare, tracer, and atmospheric effect, specifically stated that these objects were unlike anything in their training or experience. If they were German weapons, why did German pilots report the same things? And if they were illusions, why did they stop the moment the war ended? What if Foo Fighters were an emergent phenomenon related to the unprecedented scale of aerial warfare itself? Something about the electromagnetic emissions from hundreds of bombers flying together, massive radar installations, or the combination of high-altitude flight and atmospheric conditions, unique to total war? Or were they experimental remote-controlled observation drones deployed by a third party, testing surveillance technology on both sides without interference? Some researchers note the similarity to modern UAP reports. Objects that appear solid on radar and visual, demonstrate impossible flight characteristics, show no hostile intent, and remain unexplained despite investigation. Why did official investigations stop so abruptly after the war, despite thousands of credible reports? Why were the debriefing records classified and only partially released decades later? What were the objects that appeared on radar? Because multiple ground stations confirmed solid returns matching pilot descriptions, while pilots watched unexplained lights in the sky. American scientists on the ground were testing something just as strange and far more deadly: bat bombs. May 1943, you're standing at the mouth of Carlsbad Caverns at twilight. Suddenly, a black cloud erupts from the cave entrance. Not smoke, but millions of Mexican free-tailed bats. A biologist next to you grabs your arm and says, "What if we could turn them into bombers?" 6 months later, you're watching bats incinerate a mock Japanese city. The test works perfectly. The weapon is cheaper, more effective, and more reliable than the atomic bomb being developed 800 miles away. Then the program is canceled. No explanation, just gone. In January 1942, dental surgeon Lytle S. Adams was driving home from Carlsbad Caverns when he heard about Pearl Harbor. He remembered the millions of bats in the caverns and had a wild idea: attach tiny incendiary devices to bats, release them over Japanese cities, let them roost in the wooden buildings, and detonate them. He sent the proposal to the White House. Eleanor Roosevelt passed it to her husband. By April 1942, it was approved as Project X-ray. The National Research Defense Committee allocated funding. The Army Chemical Warfare Service took over development. By 1943, they'd perfected a 17-gram napalm capsule with a time delay igniter. Field tests at Dugway Proving Ground showed that bat bombs could ignite 3,625 fires per aircraft compared to 167 fires from conventional incendiary bombs. Then, in 1944, the project was abruptly canceled. Project X-ray officially began in March 1942 with approval from President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself. Chief developer Dr. Lytle S. Adams, dental surgeon from Pennsylvania, with support from Dr. Louis Fieser, Harvard chemist who invented napalm. The small incendiary device, the bat bomb, weighed 17 grams, burned at 800 degrees Celsius for 8 minutes, enough to ignite wood or paper. A live test at Carlsbad Army Airfield Auxiliary Field in May 1943 went wrong. Bats accidentally released early, roosted in base structures, and burned down several buildings, including a general's car. The December 1943 test at Dugway Proving Ground, Utah, showed bat bombs ignited a mock Japanese village more effectively than conventional incendiaries. On a weight basis, X-ray was more effective than the standard incendiary bomb, according to the official report. Estimated cost, $2 million total, compared to $2 billion for the Manhattan Project. The operational plan called for a bomber to release a canister of 1,040 hibernating bats at dawn over Japanese cities. Bats would disperse and roost in attics and eaves. Timers would detonate simultaneously at night. The project was canceled in early 1944 when the Army Chemical Warfare Service transferred priority to other incendiary programs. The official reason given: required too much time for full development. Bat bombs worked in testing but were logistically impractical for real warfare. Coordinating the breeding, hibernation, transport, and precise timing of millions of bats was a nightmare. The weapon was too unpredictable. Bats might roost in non-target areas or die in transit. By 1944, conventional firebombing with B-29s, like the March 1945 Tokyo raid, was proving devastatingly effective without the need for exotic delivery systems. The Manhattan Project promised to end the war instantly, making bat bombs obsolete. But the Dugway tests proved bat bombs were more effective per pound than conventional incendiaries, and Japanese cities were specifically vulnerable due to dense wooden construction. The logistical challenges were being solved. By late 1943, researchers had perfected bat hibernation, transport, and controlled release. Major Rexford B. Hersey, in charge of field testing, stated that bat bombs were ready for operational use and would have been deployed in mid-1945, months before the atomic bomb. So why cancel a weapon that worked, was cheap, required no rare materials, and was specifically optimized for the enemy's infrastructure? What if bat bombs were canceled because they worked too well, in a way that made military leadership uncomfortable? The weapon was uncontrollable once released. Millions of bats dispersing across a city couldn't be recalled or aimed. They'd ignite fires in hospitals, schools, temples, residential areas, total indiscriminate devastation. It was arguably more cruel than the atomic bomb because it was slow, chaotic, and targeted civilians specifically. Or perhaps cancellation came from political pressure. The project's success would have made the $2 billion Manhattan Project look like a wasteful boondoggle. Why were all test records classified until the 1990s if the project was simply a failed experiment? What happened to the 6,000 plus Mexican free-tailed bats captured and trained for the program? Why did Major Hersey publicly state in later interviews that he believed bat bombs would have ended the war faster and with fewer casualties than atomic bombs or conventional firebombing? From living incendiary weapons, we move to sound itself, weaponized into something that could shatter bone and tear apart machinery. Nazi acoustic weapons. February 1945. You're a British intelligence officer walking through an abandoned German weapons testing facility. In a massive concrete chamber, you find a strange device, arrays of tubes and parabolic reflectors aimed at a reinforced wall 200 yards away. The wall is cracked. Your Geiger counter is silent, so it's not radiation. You tap the wall with your rifle butt. It crumbles. Later, German engineers will tell you this was a sound cannon. It could kill a man at 100 yards, and it worked. Allied forces captured multiple German acoustic weapon research sites in early 1945. At Hillersleben, British investigators found a Schallkanon sound cannon, designed by Dr. Richard Woloschek, a device using explosive charges and parabolic reflectors to generate focused sound waves at 1,000 hertz. At Lofer, Austria, engineers discovered Windkanon, wind cannon, facilities that created artificial whirlwinds using detonating gas. German POWs reported that acoustic weapons had been tested on prisoners and could rupture internal organs, destroy aircraft control surfaces, and disable vehicle engines. After the war, the facilities were dismantled, the equipment destroyed, and research documents disappeared into Allied intelligence archives. The Schallkanone device, captured at Hillersleben, consisted of large parabolic reflectors using methane and oxygen explosions to create focused, low-frequency sound pulses. Dr. Richard Woloschek designed the system to generate pressure waves at approximately 1,000 hertz, low-frequency infrasound below human hearing. German test documents captured by British intelligence described effects on test animals, internal organ damage, disorientation, and death at ranges of 50 to 100 meters. A separate program, Windkanon or Wirbelwind, at Lofer, Austria, used detonating mixtures in cylinders to create artificial vortex waves. One test reportedly destroyed a wooden plank at 200 yards. Post-war interrogations of Dr. Zippermeyer, the Windkanon designer, revealed the weapon was intended as an anti-aircraft system, capable of destroying aircraft at 500-plus feet altitude. Allied technical intelligence reports from 1945 through 46 confirm both programs existed and conducted live tests, but described them as experimental and not fully operational. No acoustic weapon systems appeared in U.S., British, or Soviet arsenals for decades, despite clear evidence the technology was viable. Modern non-lethal acoustic weapons, LRAD, ADS, operating at similar frequency ranges emerged in the 2000s, with no acknowledged connection to German research. Nazi acoustic weapons were experimental dead ends that never achieved practical military effectiveness. The devices were enormous, consumed massive amounts of fuel, had extremely limited range, and required perfect conditions to work. Tests on animals and structures may have shown some damage, but these were laboratory curiosities, not battlefield weapons. The Allies evaluated the captured technology, determined it was worthless, and moved on. Modern acoustic weapons were developed independently, using completely different principles and electronic amplification. But British and American intelligence didn't treat them as worthless curiosities. They classified the research, dismantled the facilities, and buried the records for decades. If the weapons were obvious failures, why the secrecy? And the documented effects, organ damage from infrasound, structural destruction from focused acoustic waves, match exactly what modern acoustic weapons research confirms is possible. The principles were sound. The physics were correct. So why was the entire field abandoned for 50 years? What if acoustic weapons worked too well in certain applications, but were classified because they revealed vulnerabilities in military equipment or human physiology that governments didn't want public? Low-frequency infrasound can cause disorientation, nausea, and panic, effects that could be used for crowd control or psychological warfare. Or perhaps the technology was classified because it was already being developed in secret. The U.S. Navy's experiments with submarine detection and underwater acoustic warfare in the 1950s show remarkable similarity to German acoustic research, but with no paper trail connecting them. Why were German scientists who worked on acoustic weapons not recruited under Operation Paperclip, unlike rocket and jet propulsion experts? What happened to the detailed technical plans for the Schallkanone? They were catalogued by British intelligence but have never been fully declassified. Why did research into non-lethal acoustic weapons suddenly accelerate in the 1990s after a 50-year gap? What declassifications or rediscoveries triggered renewed interest? While the Nazis experimented with sound, they were also building something that looked impossible, an aircraft that wouldn't be replicated for 40 years. Horton Ho 2, 29, February 1945. You're an American aviation engineer in April 1945, walking through a captured German factory. In the corner, under a canvas tarp, sits something that doesn't look like an airplane. No fuselage, no tail, just a smooth-flying wing painted in radar-absorbent charcoal mixed with sawdust. You check the specs: jet-powered, 600 miles per hour, 3,000-mile range, nearly invisible to radar. It's supposed to carry 2,000 pounds of bombs to New York and back. You're holding technology that won't exist in any Air Force for another 40 years. By 1946, the prototype is buried in a Maryland warehouse. The plans are classified. The Horton brothers are never mentioned again. Reimar and Walter Horton began designing flying wing aircraft in the 1930s, believing the elimination of the fuselage would reduce drag and radar signature. By 1944, they'd built the Ho 9, later redesignated Ho 229, a jet-powered flying wing fighter bomber. The prototype made its first powered flight in February 1945. After Germany surrendered, U.S. forces captured the partially completed V-3 airframe and shipped it to the U.S. In 2008, a Northrop Grumman study commissioned by National Geographic tested a full-scale replica and confirmed the aircraft had significant stealth properties against 1940s radar, decades before stealth technology was officially invented. The Horton Ho 229 V3 prototype was 90% complete when captured at Friedrichsroda, Germany, in April 1945 by the U.S. Army's T-Force Technical Intelligence Unit. Design specifications: jet-powered with 2 Junkers, Jumo 004 turbojets, top speed 977 kilometers per hour, 607 miles per hour, range 1,900 kilometers, wingspan 16.8 meters. The aircraft used a flying wing design with no vertical stabilizer, reducing radar cross-section significantly. The airframe was built with wood and carbon-impregnated plywood, bonded with carbon-based glue, materials that absorb radar rather than reflecting it. In 2008, Northrop Grumman engineers built a full-scale model and tested it in a radar range against 1940s era British chain-home radar. Results showed the HO 229 had 37% lower radar cross-section than conventional aircraft of the era. Only one complete prototype, V3, survived the war. It's been stored at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum's Paul E. Garber Preservation Facility since the 1950s, but was kept in storage, not displayed, until 2011. Reimar Horton stated in later interviews from the 1980s that they specifically designed the aircraft to minimize radar reflection, anticipating that British radar would become a major defensive threat. Declassified U.S. intelligence reports from 1945 through 46 show intense interest in the Ho 229's design, but no follow-up development appeared in U.S. aviation for decades. The Ho 229 was an experimental prototype that never became operational and had no real influence on post-war aviation. Its supposed stealth properties were accidental byproducts of its flying wing design and wood construction, not intentional radar evasion. The Horton brothers were brilliant designers, but the aircraft was flawed, unstable in flight, underpowered, and vulnerable. The U.S. studied it, found nothing useful, and moved on. Modern stealth technology was developed independently by Lockheed and Northrop in the 1970s, using computer modeling and different materials. Any resemblance is coincidence. But the 2008 Northrop Grumman study wasn't some conspiracy theorist's fantasy. It was conducted by the same company that built the B-2 stealth bomber. Their engineers confirmed that the HO-229's shape and materials produced measurable stealth properties against period radar. And Reimar Horton explicitly stated in interviews that radar evasion was a design goal. So either the Horton brothers independently invented stealth principles that wouldn't be officially discovered for 30 years, or U.S. intelligence absorbed the research and buried the German origin to protect intellectual property and Cold War strategic advantage. What if the HO-229 was a missing link in stealth aviation, a bridge between conventional aircraft and modern stealth that was deliberately obscured? The Northrop YB-35 and YB-49 flying wing bombers, developed 1946 through 49, then canceled, show striking design similarities to the HO-229. Jack Northrop had access to captured German research through Operation Paperclip. His flying wings were mysteriously canceled despite successful tests, perhaps because they revealed too much about stealth research that the U.S. wanted to keep secret. Decades later, the Northrop B-2 Spirit bomber from 1989 was essentially a jet-powered flying wing. The HO-229 concept perfected. Why was the HO-229 V3 prototype kept in storage and not publicly displayed for 66 years, from 1945 to 2011? What specific technical documents and plans did the U.S. capture from the Horton workshops, and which remain classified? Why did Northrop's flying wing programs succeed in testing but fail to enter production, despite solving the stability issues that plagued the HO-229? While the Horton brothers built wings that flew below radar, other Nazi engineers were looking even higher, toward space itself. Nazi Sun Gun, 1945. You're an American officer examining captured German documents labeled Sonnengewehr, sun gun. The pages describe a space-based weapon, a massive orbital mirror 9,000 kilometers above Earth, focusing sunlight into a beam hot enough to boil oceans and ignite cities. The plans include orbital mechanics calculations, mirror construction materials, and sodium-filled reflectors. It's 1945. Sputnik won't launch for another 12 years. These engineers designed a space weapon before spaceflight existed. The documents are packed into crates, shipped to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and never seen again. In 1945, U.S. Army intelligence discovered a cache of technical documents at the German Army Artillery Proving Grounds near Hillersleben describing the Sonnengewehr sun gun project. The concept originated from Hermann Oberth, the pioneer of rocketry, who described orbital mirrors in a 1929 book. By 1945, Nazi scientists at the Artillery Research Facility had developed detailed engineering plans for a 1.7-kilometer diameter mirror, stationed in geostationary orbit, that could concentrate sunlight into a devastating heat ray. Life magazine published a brief account in 1945. Then, the story disappeared. The captured documents were classified and remain largely unreleased. The sun gun concept was originally proposed by rocket pioneer Hermann Oberth in his 1929 book Wege zur Raumschiffahrt, Ways to Spaceflight, describing orbital mirrors for peaceful purposes. By 1945, German scientists at the Artillery Proving Grounds had developed it into a weapons program with detailed technical specifications. Proposed design, metallic sodium-filled mirror, 1.7 kilometers in diameter, positioned in geostationary orbit approximately 8,200 kilometers, 5,100 miles above Earth. The mirror would focus sunlight into a beam capable of boiling water in rivers, igniting forests, and destroying cities, essentially a magnifying glass in space. Life magazine article from July 23, 1945, titled Nazi Men of Science, seriously planned to use a man-made satellite as a weapon for conquest, described the captured plans in detail, estimated construction timeline in Nazi plans, 50 to 100 years to build space stations and infrastructure needed to construct the weapon in orbit. Declassified documents show U.S. Army intelligence deemed the project technically feasible, but practically impossible given Germany's resources, meaning the physics were sound. Just the engineering was beyond 1940's capability. The documents were classified and stored at Wright-Patterson AFB, home of foreign technology analysis. But unlike V-2 rockets and jet aircraft, the Sun Gun was never publicly discussed in post-war technology assessments. The Sun Gun was pure science fiction, Nazi scientists desperate to impress Hitler with futuristic superweapon concepts that had no basis in reality. The plans were theoretical fantasies with no experimental basis, no prototype, no practical path to development. The U.S. classified the documents only because they were part of general captured enemy research, not because they had value. Post-war space programs, both American and Soviet, focused on practical rocketry and satellites, not weapons platforms that would violate international law and be militarily useless. But the physics were sound, the calculations worked. Orbital mechanics experts have confirmed that a large enough mirror in the right orbit could focus sufficient solar energy to be destructive. The concept wasn't fantasy. It was just beyond 1940's engineering capability. And the level of detail in the plans suggests serious engineering work, not idle speculation. Why would artillery research scientists spend time and scarce wartime resources on an absurd fantasy when Germany was collapsing? What if the Sun Gun wasn't about building the weapon in the 1940s, but about laying the groundwork for space-based weapons programs decades in the future? After the war, both the U.S. and Soviet Union pursued directed energy weapons research, including space-based concepts. Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative from 1983 included laser satellites and space-based interceptors, concepts that look remarkably similar to the Sun Gun principle. Were these independent developments, or did Cold War weapons designers have access to the Nazi orbital weapon research? And why, if the plans were useless, are major portions still classified 80 years later? Why did Life magazine's detailed 1945 article vanish from public discourse? Was there pressure to suppress discussion of space-based weapons? What happened to the German scientists who worked on the Sun Gun? Were any recruited under Operation Paperclip for NASA or weapons research? How much of the Sun Gun documentation remains classified, and under what justification? From weapons in the sky, we descend back to Earth, where Allied scientists were building something equally strange from ice and wood pulp. Project Habakkuk. 1943. You're standing on the frozen surface of a mountain lake in the Canadian Rockies. Beneath your feet, anchored in 60 feet of icy water, is a scale model of an aircraft carrier made of ice. Not just any ice. Pykrete, a mixture of frozen water and wood pulp that's as strong as concrete and nearly unsinkable. The plan? Build a 2,000-foot-long floating fortress mid-Atlantic, where it can refuel planes hunting German U-boats. Churchill loved it. The prototype worked. Then in 1944, the project vanished. The test facility was abandoned, and for 50 years, nobody talked about it. In 1942, inventor Jeffrey Pike proposed building massive aircraft carriers out of ice to help protect Atlantic convoys from U-boat attacks. The concept was championed by Lord Louis Mountbatten and approved by Winston Churchill. Scientists discovered that mixing wood pulp into ice created pykrete, a composite material that melted slowly, was nearly bulletproof, and could be easily repaired. In 1943, a 60-foot prototype was built on Patricia Lake in Alberta. Tests proved the concept viable. Then, in 1944, the project was canceled. The prototype was deliberately sunk. The research facility was abandoned and forgotten until the 1980s, when divers rediscovered the rusted remains. Project Habakkuk named after the biblical prophet, was proposed in 1942 by Geoffrey Pike and presented to Churchill's Combined Operations Headquarters. Pykrete composition: 14% wood pulp or sawdust, 86% ice. When frozen, the material had compressive strength comparable to concrete and melted 7 to 10 times slower than pure ice. Proposed specifications: 2,000 feet long, 300 feet wide, 200 feet deep. Displacement 2.2 million tons, larger than any ship ever built. In 1943, a 60-foot scale prototype was built on Patricia Lake, Alberta. Tests confirmed the material worked, the structure floated stably, and self-repair by spraying water over damage was effective. The design included a refrigeration system powered by aircraft engines to maintain the ice structure even in relatively warm water. Armament plans called for 50-plus anti-aircraft guns, landing deck for 100-plus fighters and bombers. Virtually unsinkable due to ice's buoyancy and ability to absorb explosions. At the 1943 Quebec Conference, Mountbatten demonstrated Pykrete's properties by shooting a block with a pistol in front of Churchill and Roosevelt. The bullet bounced off. The project was canceled in December 1944. Official reason: steel shortages eased. Escort carriers became available, and Allied air power in the Atlantic improved. Habakkuk was canceled because better alternatives emerged. By 1944, enough conventional escort carriers, converted cargo ships, were being produced to protect convoys. Allied air power closed the Atlantic Gap, where U-boats had operated freely. The ice carrier was a clever idea, but logistically impractical. It would have required enormous amounts of steel for refrigeration machinery, taken years to build, and been impossible to maneuver or defend in combat. It was a solution to a problem that ceased to exist. But the prototype worked perfectly. Pykrete was cheaper and more resilient than steel. The refrigeration requirements weren't excessive. Engineers calculated the ship could maintain structural integrity even crossing the equator. And the steel shortage excuse doesn't hold up. The Allies were simultaneously building massive conventional carriers and battleships. If Habakkuk was so impractical, why did it pass Churchill's scrutiny, Mountbatten's endorsement, and rigorous testing? What changed between successful 1943 tests and sudden 1944 cancellation? What if Habakkuk was canceled not because it failed, but because it succeeded in a way that threatened established naval power structures? The Royal Navy and U.S. Navy had invested decades and billions in steel warship construction. Admirals built careers on battleships and carriers. If a floating ice fortress built by engineers at a fraction of the cost could do the same job, it would make traditional naval power obsolete. Or perhaps the cancellation was strategic. Habakkuk's materials and design would have been easy for the Soviet Union to copy. Keeping ice carrier technology secret might have been more valuable than deploying it. Why was the Patricia Lake prototype deliberately scuttled and the facility abandoned rather than preserved for study? What happened to the detailed construction plans? They were never declassified or published. Why did no nation revisit the Pykrete concept for Arctic operations, icebreakers, or polar installations where its properties would be ideal? From ice in the mountains, we return to where we started, the dark heart of Nazi secret weapons research. But this time, we're not looking at what was built. We're looking at what soldiers saw. German infrared night vision. October 1944. You're a Soviet tanker advancing on Berlin in the darkness. No moon, no stars, total blackness. Suddenly, your T-34 explodes. Then another. Then another. You have no idea where the fire's coming from. The Germans are shooting in complete darkness with perfect accuracy. They're using something you didn't know existed, infrared night vision. By the time you capture one, the war is almost over. And when it is, the technology mysteriously disappears. For the next 15 years, neither side officially has it. Then suddenly, both do. The Germans developed two operational infrared night vision systems: the Zielgerät 1229, Vampire for infantry weapons, first deployed October 1944, and the FG 1250 for Panther tanks, deployed late 1944. These were the world's first practical active infrared systems, using infrared light sources invisible to the naked eye and converters to display images. American and Soviet forces captured examples in early 1945. The technology was classified, and both sides publicly denied possessing it for years. Then, in the 1960s, both the US and Soviet Union suddenly deployed new night vision technology based on identical principles. The Zielgerät 1229 Vampire device consisted of a 35-pound pack with battery and infrared light source, mounted on STG-44 assault rifles, effective range 400 meters at night. The FG-1250 system for Panther tanks included an infrared searchlight and viewer with 600-meter range, allowed tanks to fight in total darkness. First combat deployment, October 1944, Fallschirmjäger unit equipped with Vampire on the Eastern Front. Approximately 300 Vampire devices and 50-plus Panther tanks with FG-1250 were produced before Germany's surrender. Soviet forces captured multiple systems in January through March 1945 as they advanced through East Prussia and Silesia. U.S. Army Technical Intelligence recovered both infantry and vehicle systems from captured German facilities and cataloged them in CIOS, Combined Intelligence Objectives, Subcommittee reports. Post-war, both U.S. and Soviet militaries classified all documentation on German infrared technology. No public acknowledgement of its existence for years. The U.S. military introduced new AN/PVS, one Starlight scope in Vietnam in 1964. It used image intensification rather than active infrared, but the development path suggests knowledge of German active systems. German infrared night vision was primitive, bulky, and barely functional in combat conditions. It required heavy battery packs, had extremely limited range, and was easily blinded by enemy light sources. Both the U.S. and Soviet Union examined the captured devices, determined they were impractical, and moved on. Modern night vision technology developed in the 1950s through 60s was based on entirely different principles, image intensification and passive infrared, that were independent breakthroughs. Any similarities are superficial, but the Germans deployed the systems in combat, and soldiers on both sides reported devastating effectiveness. A Panther tank with FG-1250 could engage enemy armor in complete darkness, something no Allied tank could do until the 1960s. If the technology was so primitive and useless, why did both superpowers immediately classify everything related to it? And why did the first new U.S. night vision systems appear exactly 20 years after captured German devices arrived at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base? What if German infrared technology was classified not because it was useless, but because it was embarrassingly advanced, and both sides wanted to reverse engineer it in secret without admitting the source? Active infrared systems like Vampire were the foundation for Cold War night combat technology. The US and Soviets didn't need to reinvent the concept. They just needed to miniaturize the components and improve the power sources. The 15 to 20-year gap between capture and deployment wasn't development time. It was the time needed to reverse engineer the systems and erase the German origin from the paper trail. Why are detailed technical specifications of captured German infrared systems still partially classified 80 years later? What happened to the German engineers who developed Vampire and FG-1250? Were any recruited under Operation Paperclip? Why does the development timeline of Cold War night vision systems, 1945 capture to 1960s deployment, perfectly match the expected reverse engineering time for complex optoelectronics? These weren't fantasies. They weren't failures. They were functional technologies that worked well enough to threaten, confuse, or embarrass the victors. Die Glock vanished with the SS general who built V-2 launch sites. Tesla's death ray disappeared into FBI vaults. Japanese submarine carriers were scuttled before Soviet observers could examine them. Foo Fighters stopped appearing the moment the war ended. Bat bombs worked better than conventional incendiary weapons and were canceled without explanation. Nazi sound cannons damaged organs and structures. Then the research vanished for 50 years. The Horten stealth bomber was locked in a warehouse for 66 years. The Sun Gun's orbital weapon plans were classified despite being impossible. Habakkuk's ice fortress worked perfectly and was abandoned after one test. German night vision let soldiers fight in total darkness, and both sides pretended they'd never seen it. The official story is simple. These were experimental dead ends, wartime desperation, or Cold War disinformation. The war produced thousands of wild ideas, and these 10 just happened to be the ones conspiracy theorists latched onto. But the evidence tells a different story. These weren't fringe projects run by cranks. They were serious programs with documentation, funding, and in many cases, successful tests. They weren't buried because they failed. They were buried because they succeeded in ways that threatened official narratives, violated international law, or revealed secrets that post-war powers wanted to keep. History is written by the victors, but it's also classified by them. The gap between what happened and what we're told happened isn't always a lie. Sometimes it's strategy. Sometimes it's embarrassment. Sometimes it's just easier to let the world believe that stealth technology, night vision, and directed energy weapons were invented cleanly in American and Soviet labs, rather than admit they were first perfected by the regime we defeated. World War II didn't end with unconditional surrender. It ended with the greatest intelligence heist in history, Operation Paperclip on the American side, Operation Ossuavi Akim on the Soviet side. Thousands of scientists, engineers, and documents were seized, classified, and quietly absorbed. And somewhere in that transfer, entire branches of technology disappeared. Most people see a museum exhibit on World War II weapons, machine guns, tanks, maybe a V-2 rocket, and think they're seeing the whole story. They accept the timeline they were taught, primitive 1940s technology, then decades of slow progress, then modern innovation. But you made it here. You followed the handprints into the dark. You're the person who sees the gaps in the official story and asks why. You understand that silence isn't proof of absence. Sometimes silence is the loudest evidence of all.